Have you ever watched someone you care about build walls so high that even they can't see over them? Today we're diving deep into how avoidant fear was exposed and what happens when those carefully constructed barriers finally come crashing down. Fear has a peculiar way of disguising itself as strength, doesn't it? The person who never needs anyone, who glides through life with an almost supernatural independence, might actually be running the most elaborate emotional con game ever devised. Picture this scenario, if you will. Someone enters a relationship with the confidence of Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl stepping into Bergdorf Goodman. Yet beneath that polished exterior lies a terror so profound it could rival any horror story. The avoidant individual has spent years, perhaps decades, perfecting the art of emotional sleight of hand. They've convinced themselves and everyone around them that they simply don't need the messy complications of deep connection. But here's what most people don't realize about avoidant attachment patterns. The fear isn't about being hurt by others, though that's certainly part of the equation. The deeper terror lies in the possibility of being truly seen, truly known, and still being found wanting. It's the ultimate vulnerability nightmare wrapped in a cloak of seeming invulnerability. When someone has spent their entire life believing that their authentic self is somehow fundamentally flawed or unworthy of love, they develop remarkable skills at keeping people at just the right distance. Close enough to avoid loneliness, far enough away to maintain the illusion of safety. This creates what psychologists call the confirmation bias trap. The mind seeks evidence that supports existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory information. So when an avoidant person experiences genuine care or affection from others, their brain works overtime to explain it away. They might think the person doesn't really know them yet, or that they're being manipulated, or that it's temporary infatuation that will surely fade once reality sets in. Every act of love becomes evidence of either deception or temporary madness on the part of the giver. But what happens when this carefully orchestrated emotional theater finally gets disrupted? What occurs when the avoidant person encounters a situation or relationship that refuses to play by their established rules? The exposure of avoidant fear is rarely a gentle, gradual process. More often, it resembles a dam bursting after years of mounting pressure. The very strategies that once provided protection suddenly become the source of profound pain. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Consider the story of Marcus, a successful architect who had perfected the art of romantic relationships that never quite became real relationships. Like Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, Marcus was intensely observant of others, but unlike Joe, Marcus used his insights to maintain distance rather than obsess. He had a pattern that worked beautifully for years. Meet someone interesting, enjoy a few months of passionate connection, then find something fundamentally incompatible about them just as things began to deepen. The timing was never coincidental. Marcus told himself he was simply selective, that he had high standards, that he was waiting for the right person. His friends admired his independence. His family stopped asking about his love life. He had successfully created a life that looked full and satisfying from the outside, while remaining emotionally isolated at its core. The cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error played a starring role in Marcus's internal narrative. When relationships ended, he attributed the failure to the other person's character flaws rather than examining his own behavioral patterns. Then came Sarah, and with her arrival, the entire carefully constructed system began to show cracks. Sarah didn't follow the script. When Marcus began his usual dance of subtle withdrawal, she didn't chase or cling as others had done. She didn't try to convince him of her worth or negotiate for his attention. Instead, she simply remained herself. Available but not desperate, interested but not invested in outcomes she couldn't control. This unexpected response triggered something Marcus had never experienced before. For the first time, his avoidance strategies weren't working, and worse yet, he found himself genuinely wanting them not to work. The internal conflict was excruciating. Every instinct screamed at him to find an exit, to locate some fatal flaw in Sarah that would justify his retreat. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed, desperately wanted to stay and see what might be possible if he stopped running. The turning point came during what should have been a routine dinner conversation. Sarah mentioned that she'd been offered a job in another city, something that would normally have provided Marcus with the perfect excuse to end things naturally. Instead of relief, he felt something that took him several minutes to identify as panic. Not the familiar panic of being trapped or suffocated, but the entirely foreign panic of potential loss. In that moment, sitting across from this woman who had somehow slipped past all his defenses, Marcus realized that his fear of being hurt was actually dwarfed by his fear of missing out on something real. But the story doesn't end with a simple revelation and transformation. Real change is messier than that, and Marcus's journey toward vulnerability was anything but linear. The exposure of his avoidant fear brought with it a host of uncomfortable truths about the life he'd built and the connections he'd sacrificed in the name of emotional safety. The path forward would require dismantling years of protective mechanisms without any guarantee that what he built in their place would be better or safer. Now, what can we learn from Marcus's experience? And more importantly, how can someone begin to address their own avoidant patterns or better understand them in others? The first crucial step involves recognizing that avoidance isn't actually about strength or independence, despite how it might appear. True independence comes from the ability to choose connection or solitude based on genuine preference, not from a compulsive need to avoid intimacy out of fear. This distinction is vital because it shifts the conversation from one of character strength to one of learned survival strategies. Understanding the difference between chosen solitude and fearful avoidance requires honest self-examination. Ask yourself this question and really sit with the discomfort of considering it deeply. When you pull away from others, is it because you genuinely prefer your own company in that moment? Or is it because getting closer feels dangerous? The answer often lies in your physical and emotional responses. Chosen solitude typically feels peaceful and restorative. Fearful avoidance usually carries an undercurrent of tension, vigilance, or relief that feels more like escape than genuine preference. The second step involves recognizing and challenging the cognitive biases that maintain avoidant patterns. Remember confirmation bias, how the mind seeks evidence that supports existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory information. Someone with avoidant tendencies might interpret a partner's patience as evidence that they haven't shown their true self yet, rather than considering that they might actually be worthy of that patience. They might view expressions of love with suspicion, assuming ulterior motives rather than accepting them at face value. Breaking these patterns requires what psychologists call cognitive restructuring. This means actively looking for evidence that contradicts your fears, rather than only focusing on evidence that confirms them. When someone shows you consistent care and affection, instead of immediately wondering what they want or when they'll leave, try asking yourself what it might mean if their care is genuine. What would change about your worldview if you truly were worthy of love, exactly as you are, flaws and all? The third step is perhaps the most challenging because it requires action rather than just insight. You must practice vulnerability in small, manageable doses. Think of it like physical therapy after an injury. You don't immediately try to run a marathon. You start with small movements and gradually build strength and range of motion. Emotional vulnerability works the same way. Start by sharing something slightly more personal than feels completely comfortable. Notice what happens in your body when you do this. Does your chest tighten? Do you immediately want to change the subject or make a joke to deflate the moment? These physical responses are your nervous system's way of trying to protect you, but they're operating on outdated information. Your adult self can handle emotional risks that would have been overwhelming to your younger self. The key is moving toward vulnerability slowly enough that you don't trigger your entire system into shutdown mode, but quickly enough that you actually build new neural pathways and experiences. Here's something that might surprise you about this process. The goal isn't to eliminate your ability to maintain boundaries or to become someone who shares everything with everyone. Healthy relationships actually require the ability to be both vulnerable and boundaried, to open your heart while still maintaining your sense of self. The problem with avoidant patterns isn't that they include self-protection. It's that the protection has become so automatic and pervasive that it prevents genuine connection, even when that connection would be safe and nourishing. Learning to distinguish between situations that actually warrant caution and situations where your fear is based on old wounds rather than present reality becomes a crucial skill. This is where mindfulness practices can be incredibly helpful. When you notice yourself wanting to withdraw or create distance, pause and ask yourself what's actually happening right now versus what you're afraid might happen based on past experiences. Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris might approach new relationships with wide-eyed optimism, but you don't have to swing to that extreme either. The goal is conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. The fourth step involves learning to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty. Avoidant patterns often develop as a way to maintain the illusion of control in relationships. If you never fully invest, you can't be fully disappointed. If you always have one foot out the door, you can't be abandoned. But this strategy comes with an enormous cost, namely the impossibility of experiencing the deep satisfaction and security that come with genuine mutual investment. Learning to be okay with not knowing how things will turn out is perhaps one of life's most challenging but rewarding skills. It means accepting that love always involves risk, that there are no guarantees, and that the alternative to risking heartbreak is the certainty of emotional isolation. When you think about it that way, the choice becomes clearer, even if it doesn't become easier. This brings us to our final and most important point. The exposure of avoidant fear isn't actually something that happens to you, it's something that happens through you. It requires your active participation and willingness to question long-held beliefs about yourself and others. It means being curious about your patterns rather than defensive about them. It means treating your fears as information to be examined rather than truths to be protected. The beautiful paradox of addressing avoidant attachment is that the very act of acknowledging your tendency to avoid actually requires you to move toward connection. You can't heal isolation in isolation. This doesn't mean you need to bare your soul to everyone you meet, or that you should ignore red flags in relationships. It means creating space for the possibility that some people might actually be trustworthy, that some connections might actually be worth the risk, and that your younger self's strategies for survival might not be your adult self's best path toward thriving. Remember Marcus from our earlier story? His journey didn't end with a Hollywood-style transformation where everything suddenly became easy. Instead, he learned to catch himself in his avoidant patterns more quickly. He developed the ability to communicate about his fears rather than just acting them out through withdrawal. He discovered that Sarah and later others could handle his imperfections and occasional need for space without disappearing or becoming resentful. Most importantly, he learned that vulnerability isn't a one-time event but an ongoing practice. Some days he was brave and open, other days his old patterns would resurface, especially during times of stress or transition. The difference was that he now had tools to recognize what was happening and make different choices when he was ready. Your own journey with avoidant patterns, whether they're yours or belong to someone you care about, won't look exactly like Marcus's story. But the principles remain the same: recognition, challenge, practice, and patience with the process. Fear loses much of its power when it's brought into the light and examined honestly. Those walls that once felt like protection can become bridges to deeper connection when you're ready to see them differently. The exposure of avoidant fear isn't something to be feared itself, but rather something to be welcomed as the beginning of genuine choice in how you relate to others. When you're no longer controlled by unconscious patterns, you become free to connect authentically or to maintain solitude consciously, and that freedom is worth every moment of discomfort the journey might require.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.